Dear Lord, as we handle these sensitive subjects so close to the Sunday law, as we look at why this is a history of failure for feminism, we ask that you teach us how to view current events, how to view politics. They are so central to the great controversy. May we understand correctly. Please be with us, teach us, guide us, and may we trust you. In Jesus' name, amen. I want to start with a little bit of an exercise that I've wanted to do for some time now, but never had willing participants and the forum. So I think we all know what I mean when I say a word association, that game where someone says a word and you have to create a mental picture, and you have to let it be kind of organic. Just hear the word, have a flash of a picture, and then once you have the picture, you're not really allowed to alter it. Do people know what I'm talking about? Does anyone not know what I'm talking about? If there's no hands, I'm going to assume everyone knows what I'm talking about. So if I was to say some words and you were to have that mental picture, if I was to say tree, picture a tree, house, flower, God. So maybe this would have worked a few years ago a little bit better. But when I say God, what's the visual that's created? So don't answer that now. It's just without going back in and trying to alter the image once it rises. I'll keep going. Moon, book, fry pan, goddess. What I've wanted to do is ask people, if you take the mental picture you had when I said God and the mental picture when I said goddess, and you put them side by side in your brain, calculate approximately the age difference between the two pictures. It's the age I want to see. So the picture of God, I'm not saying the Christian God, it could be Thor for all I really care, but just God, and then the mental picture of goddess. Did anyone not have an age difference? Does anyone want to play ball with me? Graham.
My mind went to, when you said God, a picture of something we've seen from like Desire of Ages, you know, where you get your pictures there of Desire of Ages, this glow around Jesus in a robe. So quite young. And when you said goddess, I had a similar young image of what was like Cleopatra or someone like that.
I think it's cheating to use Jesus though. I'm not looking for the incarnation, but I see your point. I could see what happened there. I can't fight with what was the picture that arose. Whatever rose. Does anyone want to confess to having an age difference?
I had an age difference. Oh, sorry. I should have put it in the thing.
Oh, good, Lynn. You had an age difference. How many years do you think?
Well, God, the picture was like the white flowing beard type thing, so very old, so maybe 60s, 70s, 80s. But and then the goddess would have been probably 30s to 40s, so quite a significant age difference, really. And it wasn't what I wanted to think. It was like trying to let my mind just think it without correcting it. So
Yes, I understand. James, you had an age difference, and I'm assuming the other hands as well are all indicating the age difference.
Similar to her, but not so old. More with God, it's younger, middle-aged, and the females are probably just a bit younger, maybe 10 years or so. I would
20s and 50s rather than like 30s and 60s.
yeah,
70s.
like that, yeah.
Was that the same for you, Brodie?
I think I had about a 50-year age difference in there.
Catherine?
Yeah, about 50 years for me as well. About a 30-year-old goddess and probably 80 for the older man on the throne.
Now, obviously, no one did this to me as without a surprise, but in investigating my own brain, I would say I'd have about a 40-year age gap between what just comes up when I think of God versus what comes up when I think of a goddess. And that's not all Christian based, that's Greek mythology based, that's just cultural. Unless you start thinking of a goddess and people think old woman, I think what they're doing then is they're tending to, I think their brain has switched out goddess for witch. But when you keep it as God versus goddess, then then what I've seen in my own experience, in other people I've spoken to, for the vast majority, it's about a 40, 50-year age gap between the mental picture of a goddess and the mental picture of a god. I've wanted to do this to, I guess, just to make the point of what we're doing when we critique the terms that we use in this movement, when we critique language, where we call each other brother and sister, or someone an aunt, or he is an elder, even if he's not ordained, all of that language that has at its root, whether it's subconscious or conscious, a gendered root. What we are doing as a movement and as leadership is it is psychological warfare. It is mind games, because the problem is not in the terms so much, or the terms themselves. The problem is in our brain wiring. It's how we're wired. And our issue with these terms is how that psychologically impacts with our inbuilt cultural biases. I don't think that how we picture a god as older is all Christian based. It's just cultural. You could watch a Hollywood movie and get the same idea about a god and a goddess, but it also shows us what culture worships in men versus what culture worships in women. It shows why a culture treats older women a certain way, while culture tends to ignore the voices of older women, whereas sees the voices of older men as being associated with power and wisdom. It has so many deep-set cultural implications. So it's just fascinates me when people in the movement continue to feel attacked or to push back when we are asking them to stop saying brother or sister, especially when women are saying, please stop calling me sister. I think it's so misogynistic and downright abusive to not listen to the terms that someone wishes to be called by. But what we are all doing is trying to fight that wiring in our brains. And some people have asked me about the pronouns we use for God. Can't we just say goddess? Won't that fix everything? And I think this touches on why it really, really wouldn't. Because if we just say goddess, all we're doing is moving away the 60, 70, 80-year-old for the 20, 30-year-old version. It does nothing to change our brain wiring to picture God as female. All it does is give us a different cultural version of what a goddess can be. Young, attractive, jealous, but in a different way. Probably a little bit manipulative, plays games, all of the cultural ideas associated with a goddess. Of course, the nurturing, all of those aspects. And we end up with a Mary, you know, the young 20-something Mary, as opposed, and I'm sure she wasn't that young, but we just substitute that for the 60-year-old, grey-haired, bearded, elderly male. So I think we should consider why we're doing what we're doing with some deliberateness. It helps to change our practices, but if we really know why we're changing them, the fight we're having with our own brain wiring, I think it makes it more powerful and helpful. If someone slips up and calls me sister, that's okay. But if I've asked them not to and we've explained the problem with their brain wiring and they continue to, I think there's a major problem in how much they think sexism is an issue in society and in themselves. So thank you for accommodating me. We said a fair bit last week. We have gone more into the issues with the left wing than I initially intended to state, but I think we've gotten to the point where I'm being fairly explicit with what I believe the problem with the left wing to be. There's also been an article shared this week on feminism that laid out some of the reasons that the Sunday law becomes inevitable when feminism fails amongst Democrats, amongst the left wing. Obviously, that indicates a much larger problem with the left wing if feminism is so unpopular. There's another article that's not yet shared but will be soon addressing feminism as well, and again touches on left wing failure. But I want to take a little bit of time and just go through a review, and you can stop me at any time, just put your hand in the chat, and we have kind of moved off on tangents a number of times, and there might be things that we didn't really complete or points you still have questions and thoughts over, and we can stop at any point to discuss those. We began with a question that was asked. We were meant to be studying, is that going to focus? Meant to be studying 1888, but someone asked, how do you sift media? And the focus was on generally left-wing media or trustworthy sources. We weren't considering how to sift Fox News because we just don't bother. So how do you sift left-wing media sources? And before going much further, I wanted to prove, first of all, that we even needed to. So I really wanted to nail in that point that the left wing needed to be sifted in the first place. If you're going to sift media, then they must have issues. They must have problems that are endemic. So let's prove that they have endemic problems and then analyze what those problems are so we can all spot them. Ray's own proof of problems. Grey Zone, Max Blumenthal, we went into that history. Then we left it there for a moment and said, well, what does it mean to be left-wing in the first place? And we defined, we went to the Midnight Cry and explained 2018 why we are left-wing. And then we attempted to define I would say the fundamental difference between left-wing and right-wing politics. There's quite a number of differences, but we wanted to get to a fundamental root, especially when it comes to social policies. So defining the left wing, the right wing, the differences between the two, we discussed left wing was equality over freedom, and right wing was freedom over equality. That doesn't easily work internationally if you have a country that doesn't even believe in giving its citizens the basic tenets of freedom. Then it becomes a little bit more complicated. But when you have a country like the United States that has embodied so many principles that prophetically are described as glorious, then you have to see the fight in a little bit more of a subtle way. Freedom is a good thing. It fought for freedom from the British, from the rule of Britain. It's that part of their history is a fight to have freedom in the first place. But through that history, it's become more and more clearly a fight between these two bedrock principles, because when they collide, one has to take precedence over the other. Obviously, we want freedom. You don't want a surveillance state like China has. Obviously, that there are some privacies citizens should have. But they have to have a balance. And then when equality for a group who is marginalized or oppressed comes under threat, then that priority has to supersede over the rest of the population's rights to freedom. And this is what the left wing and the right wing often war over. I don't know, hopefully people watched what was put on the media broadcast from the New York Times about January 6th. I don't know if you watched that and heard freedom, 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 freedom. What is the right wing fighting for? Freedom. We went into detail and gave many examples, the trucker protests, all of these examples to prove what they're fighting for is freedom. I've said it before and I'm going to state this more explicitly and in more detail, I know in the future, but left-wing journalism in general, can slip into the habit of being lazy. And it's so much easier to look at the Canada truckers, find the neo-Nazi flag and say they just want to suppress people of colour, they're just white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and leave it that simply. And there are people there who, the vast majority are very much not, but they're fighting for freedom. If we can't see what that fight is fundamentally over, then we can't really see why or how we disagree with them. And if you can't see what you're disagreeing with, you come into danger of ending up on the same side. I think that's why so many Democrats watch Tucker Carlson. They aren't actually even able to pick up on what he's saying because it's not so explicit as I think we've been led to believe. So seeing the battle between equality, freedom, freedom and equality, and we used a Supreme Court case to really prove that, to give one example out of many, and that's Masterpiece Cake Shop. I'll just say cakes, versus Colorado, and I'll just do Civil Rights Commission. Civil rights, prioritize equality. Masterpiece Cake Shop was all about their freedom. I had a quote, but I don't think I'm going to find it. It ties back to a long history of this war between equality and freedom, and I touched on it, but you can really see it when it comes to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Quite a lot of the opposition to the Civil Rights Act was by people who vowed that they were not racists. They were against government-enforced segregation, but they were also against government-enforced integration. And the Civil Rights Act, it ended government-enforced segregation, but it brought in government-forced integration, most clearly seen in schools, but also in many private businesses. And many people opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Goldwater being one of them, who was one of the foremost people who brought libertarianism into the Republican Party. Goldwater opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and he did so with a lot of guilt on his conscience, because he said he wanted racial equality, but he firmly believed in freedom over equality. The government should not be enforcing segregation. That was good that the Civil Rights Act brought that to an end, but the government should not enforce integration. So the government should not force schools to allow in students of colour. It should not force business owners, private business owners, to serve non-white patrons. So it's a long-term fight that has been ongoing between equality and freedom, but post second wave feminism, post Stonewall, it's become even more and more explicit that this is what the fight is about. Then we went to Max, and he symbolises a large part of that right-wing, even far-right ideology that is so popular today. And we looked at the statistics of how unpopular feminism is. It's being replaced by something. And there's this popular, very much popular trinity, especially among young men, but it is, as I've said before, it's a younger demographic, and it's that trinity. We asked, what happens when you strive for absolute freedom? We looked at the Vox article and the Trinity. And that Trinity being libertarianism, atheism, and men's rights. Libertarianism, atheism, men's rights, opposition to feminism. We haven't touched on the third one so much, but we've touched on the first and the second, and it was here that we went into libertarianism. Let's look at more pure freedom. You might notice a shift in our classes. When we were doing all this, we were looking very much at domestic policy. But as we moved toward the left wing to see the problems with the left wing, we started to look more at foreign policy. How do they handle Syria? How do they handle Russia? How do they handle China? How do they handle Libya? that isn't because those issues are separate. They're very much overlapping. It's just been easier to see. It's easier to see libertarianism if you look at domestic policy. It's easier to see the problems with the left wing and the views of the grey zone if you look at foreign policy. But all of these issues interconnect. It's not as if you have domestic policy and foreign policy. They're all really very much interconnected. So I wanted to actually stop here and just make a couple of observations about libertarianism. Libertarianism as that beautiful picture that if a society that does have problems with equality, that it does mistreat portions of the population, take a society that is sexist, that's patriarchal, libertarianism sells the idea, and I'll take it how members or former members of the movement sold this idea. If there are sexist members of the movement, sexist men primarily, but also women, that have been abusive, then we should not remove them from classes. We should not reprimand them. We should not accuse them. What we should do is allow everyone absolute freedom. Freedom to attend what presentations they want, to attend camp meetings alongside women that they've mistreated. We should listen to them, hear their side of the story, as if we don't. We should just prioritize freedom, be non-accusatory, and not ever enact discipline. And then as this freedom-conscious movement progresses, then through dialogue, through friendship, through community, those who have wrong views will learn, they will grow, they will change, and we can all just get along without punishing people or accusing people. And it's been an appealing message for quite a lot of people. Does everyone remember what we've said about libertarianism, the message it sells versus the reality? Or does anyone have any confusion or questions? We're not quite done with libertarianism because we're going to come back to it when we discuss the paleo versus neoconservatism. But I just wanted us to remember that picture it sells that is so appealing, and it appeals to me. It sounds beautiful until you look at human nature and reality. But I wanted us to take that picture, which we've discussed libertarianism domestically, and in the context of the Civil Rights Act and the idea that the government shouldn't force segregation or force integration, but just create a free country where everyone can discriminate or not discriminate as they like, and then you'll create social change through working together and dialoguing. Let's take that, what we have discussed domestically, and consider it internationally. How does that then work with international foreign policy? And I'm not saying that a libertarian would necessarily take this foreign policy position. There's quite a spectrum. But I think there's a few things that we can learn when we picture that nice image and take it to foreign policy. And I wanted us to consider Germany's example. The Guardian long read was really good this week. I don't always read them because they're long reads, but The Guardian did a long read this week on Germany's dependence on Russia. And as I read that long read, it really stood out that Germany had that same beautiful picture as libertarians sell in the United States. And it was interesting seeing that play out internationally in the way Germany has related to not just Russia, but China, especially Russia and China, but authoritarian countries in general. What Germany did right back in the 1980s, right back in the history when the Soviet Union was still in existence, was they had this belief, and they had a term for it, Wandel durch Handel, which translates as change through trade. What they really fought for, and this was, you can trace it right back to that history, but it's also been through the 2000s and right up until very recently, the belief that trade and dialogue can bring about social and political change. So through the history of the Cold War, especially those last decades, Germany and the United States were on very different paths in how they wanted to handle the Soviet Union. The United States, obviously with a lot of variety between presidents, but certainly by the time they get to Ronald Reagan, they're wanting to be quite aggressive with the Soviet Union. They're wanting to challenge them. There's a space race, there's an arms race. Germany had a different position. Germany held and has held until recently, and still some today, this belief that that doesn't work. And you can change authoritarian countries, abusive countries, through stepping back, letting them operate how they want to operate in the abusive fashion they want to operate, but through trade and dialogue, bringing them into the global economy, bringing them into closer into integration, that through that you will bring about social change. And there's a couple of reasons that Germany had that, took that position. I'm focusing on Russia, but if I use, this is a quote from the Carnegie Endowment, Germany's strategic grey zone with China. They say, like other Western democracies, including the United States, Germany was convinced that China's authoritarian politics would morph into a free, open, and more democratic system through ever-tightening economic ties. So we don't punish them, we don't sanction them, we don't build up our own arms, we don't intervene, we don't tell them off internationally, we bring them in. We communicate, we make our ties closer. And this is all analysed in this latest Guardian's long read. And I just want to read a little of it. I will ask the question and I'll come back to it in a moment. Why do you think Germany had that position? Why do you think that they were so nervous to accuse another country? Quoting, how did Germany end up making such a blunder? Some argue that Merkel should have seen that Putin was taking Russia in an authoritarian direction when he announced his return to the presidency in 2011. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014, Germany made no move to stop importing Russian gas. And although Merkel threatened to introduce crippling trade sanctions, German industry convinced her to hold back. But some blame a more persistent misjudgment stretching back 50 years, based on a fallacy that our authoritarian, abusive countries can be transformed through trade. Why do you think Germany has this kind of psychological position? Graham.
Is this something that they would have liked done to them during the Second World War, to come at it from a different way other than from discipline? Is that what you're getting at?
I think if that's as a complete answer as you want to give, I might go to Josephine and then, so I don't give my thoughts while people are talking. Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
I'll take everyone's feedback. Thanks. Josephine.
I think it's because of the position they took in the World War. they were very aggressive. So now they want to sit back and dialogue instead of, attacking.
I'll comment in a moment. Thank you. Molly?
I think it's because they had a very bad experience in the Second World War, and they don't want us to go through it again. So they rather dialogue and solve the problems, and instead of putting sanction and discipline and all that.
I think you've touched on what those kind of investigating the roots of Germany's hesitancy have said. The article quotes Thomas Urban. He's examined the psychological roots of Ostpolitik. They're really quite libertarian foreign policy attitude. And he pinpoints two emotions in Germany's relationship with Russia: nostalgia and guilt. So nostalgia is particularly the memory of Bismarck, who saw the alliance with Russia as an anchor of stability in Europe. So it's going back to pre-World War I, where Bismarck, who was quite important for them, believed that you could keep stability throughout Europe through alliances, and that there is still some nostalgia for that type of position, even where countries have differences and issues, that if you just keep alliances, that you can have stability. But I think the more deeper underlying one, which I think Josephine, you particularly articulated, is guilt. There was the feeling of guilt because in 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union and killed millions. It meant it was difficult to criticize the Red Army or the Soviet oppression, since to do so means they were not recognizing the greatest crimes in history, particularly Germany's, heavy on Germany. And because of that, it made Germany blind to the black side of the Soviet Union. So they're going back to the history of the Cold War, when the United States was taking an aggressive position in opposition to the Soviet Union, and Germany was much more gentle. And there's the nostalgia, but there's also the guilt, and that guilt has blinded their view, where not only are they unwilling to rebuke another country's human rights violations or another country's imperialism, they also had trouble seeing it.
Interesting.
And they say how this has helped Putin's propaganda, because Russia doesn't, overall, the vast majority of it, doesn't have guilt for Stalin. They have rewritten their history. Stalin was a hero. The Soviet Union stopped Nazi Germany. Putin wants to take all the credit of that for Russia, the fatherland. The Soviet Union killed millions, but because Germany has carried the guilt of World War II, and the Soviet Union has not carried, especially Russia today, culturally, I know there are individuals who see things differently, and many of those individuals have fled the country now, but as a country, they don't carry guilt for the history of Stalin, the history of the Soviet Union. That is what was worst in that history has been heavily rewritten. But Germany's different. They haven't rewritten their history. Instead, they've created pillars to it, memorials to it. They've taught it at their schools. And that's a good thing. That's what the United States is needing to do with its own history. You need to remember it. There needs to be a sense of cultural guilt of what has taken place in the past, because it's impacting the present, because you don't want it to happen again. An arrangement that began as a peacetime opening to a former foe, so how Germany kind of opened up to Russia has turned into an instrument of aggression. Germany is now funding Russia's war. In the first 2 months after the start of Russia's assault on Ukraine, Germany is estimated to have paid nearly 8.3 billion euro for Russian energy, money used by Moscow to prop up the ruble and buy the artillery shells firing at Ukrainian positions on Donetsk. In that time, EU countries are estimated to have paid a total of 39 billion euros for Russian energy. This is more than double the amount that European countries have given to Ukraine to help defend itself. So if Zelensky doesn't seem super grateful, as much as he's being given to help defend his country, Russia has been given double that by the European Union to pay for Russian energy. And that has been something that has been developing for decades. Nord Stream 2 was an agreement between Germany and Russia for Russian energy that bypasses Ukraine and further weakens Ukraine, makes it weaker in the face of Russian aggression. Germany signed on to Nord Stream 2 in 2015, a year after Russia invaded Ukraine the first time. So if Zelensky doesn't seem super grateful, then... But why has Germany taken this position? Quoting the historian Timothy Snyder, for 30 years, Germans lectured Ukrainians about fascism. When fascism actually arrived, Germans funded it and Ukrainians died fighting it. So Germany's beautiful picture, I want to describe it as a libertarian picture, that when you have an abusive country, which I would bring in, I'm substituting for the idea of an abusive individual, when you have misogyny and abuse in a person, substitute that for a country. When you have that, the idea that through trade, through integration, they invaded Ukraine, but don't make them uneasy. We'll sign Nord Stream 2. Putin's reasonable. He'll back down. We'll engage in dialogue. Even in 2021, as he started preparing on the border of Ukraine and France and Germany are saying, dialogue will fix this, dialogue will fix this. Putin won't invade. He's not going to do that. So much of that is this same kind of wishful thinking, that you don't need foreign intervention, that you don't need a military, that integration and trade, that beautiful picture, can solve these kinds of problems. And now Ukraine is paying for it. And Germany's, the approach Germany has taken to Russia is under intense scrutiny. Not just intense scrutiny for what it's done the last few years, but why did they sign on to Nord Stream 2 in the first place? Why did they take the approach of the last half century? And it has, I think this has a lot of domestic lessons to teach us about the United States, but also about how the United States should allow its past transgressions, the Iraq War as a recent one, and more historical transgressions, slavery. How much should that affect the United States' willingness to engage with foreign countries today? I saw a little bit of Max Blumenthal speaking on the Grey Zone, and he was attacking US restrictions on Chinese imports. And the very beginning of his attack against the US restrictions on Chinese imports, he began by reminding everyone that the date he was doing this video was the anniversary of the United States invasion of Iraq, and the hypocrisy of the United States to take a hardline approach with China over China's mistakes, even though he denies that China has mistakes, but a hardline approach with China when they invaded Iraq. And this type of whataboutism gets brought into this left-wing, right-wing, isolationist, interventionalist argument in the United States. And I think we should look to Germany to kind of unite the three different topics we've been discussing: libertarianism domestically, the beautiful picture versus the reality, America's own transgressions versus whether or not intervention is necessarily a bad thing, and then consider it in the context of not just Germany, but Europe's slow response to rising human rights abuses in Russia. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions so far? Does it make it, is that clear what we've done, that we've taken the discussion we had on internal libertarianism, that beautiful picture, and kind of compared and contrasted it, mostly compared it to how Germany approached the Soviet Union and Russia? Does that make sense? I see some nodding and no one is shaking their head so far, so that's okay. I think it's an interesting lesson because we're dealing with, when you deal with the left wing, so much of it is also touching on foreign policy, and so much is opposed to US interventionalism. And I've been asking the question, is that necessarily progressive? Is it right for America's guilt over Iraq to prevent it from intervening today? And is that intervention necessarily neo-imperialism, new imperialism? There was a third article that I wanted to share on exactly this point. It was to be the third of the kind of third addition to the last two I've already shared. And it was about progressives in the United States and their hesitancy to defend Ukraine. It says, acknowledging the United States' failings doesn't mean ignoring Russian imperialism. The point he was trying to make in this article was that we can acknowledge the United States' failings, but that shouldn't necessarily stop intervention today. It's not that simple. I'm not going to share that article because on rereading it, I had too many problems. And perhaps once we get further on in sifting, perhaps then I'll give it out and ask us to actually discuss what's wrong with it. But I don't want us to try and analyse what's wrong with it now. But there were things that troubled me to the point I've decided not to share it. So at the moment, we just have those first two articles, and please reread them. So I wanted to touch on Germany when we discussed libertarianism, because domestic and foreign policy are in many ways overlapping. Then we discussed atheism. How it is disproportionately found in the far right. So of the Trinity doctrine, we discussed libertarianism and we discussed atheism. And by the time we'd done that, we'd made the first point that I wanted to make to help us unpack the left wing's problems. And that was, first point, that it is not church and state that are the problem, but instead it's culture. Which is why we have heard and discussed so much about a culture war. We made a kind of secondary additional point to that, where we said if it is this type of political culture war, how do we also then view the Great Controversy? And we made the point that the Great Controversy itself is also a war, a political election. So that's kind of a separate point, but it was an important one. So I'm going to add it in there. Great controversy equals an election. An election between two political parties, two different ways of governing, equality over freedom, or an alternative that was offered in heaven and then Eden, freedom over equality. This is about as far as we got before we were forced to bring all this back in. So we're back to the start again, and that's particularly what I wanted us to see in reviewing, that we went back, at this point, we went back to the grey zone, but we expanded it to again prove there's a left-wing problem. But we can do that once we have broken down this, and then we are building it back to discuss how we sift media. How do we sift the true stream? Because we shouldn't even be swimming in the wrong one. To help explain why the grey zone and the right wing, really far right, seem to agree on so many things, we began to explain neo versus paleo conservatism, and this is where we will continue. Unless anyone has any thoughts or questions about what is on the board so far or where we've been. Everyone's fine with that? Okay, great. Can someone explain to me the difference between paleo and neoconservatism?
Old and new. Yeah.
Who would explain for me? I'm not entirely sure who's participating tonight, so I won't pull people out just in case. Brody.
So if I remember right, paleo means old and it's historical or the original, and neo means new.
So paleo is old. Can you think of other times you've heard the word neo before?
I think I have a mental blank. There'll be obvious ones.
The minute I asked you that, I knew you would, because that's what I would do. My brain shuts down when I have those kinds of questions. Do you have anything else to add there?
No.
Brendan.
I'm not sure where I've heard neo, but I was going to just add a bit more on old and new. One is they intervene, and one is an isolationist viewpoint when it comes to foreign policy.
I think that's the easiest way in one sentence to divide the two. It has a plethora of implications though. So paleo old is isolation. And you've told us that neo new is intervention. And obviously we don't believe that all intervention is neoconservative, but I'll keep it like that for now. Anything else, Brendan?
No, that's it.
Josephine.
I think I might have heard you wrong because I was thinking of the word neo attached to some other word. Maybe I'm way off the chart. I was thinking of neonatal, neo-Nazi.
Yes. No, that's exactly right.
Oh, okay.
Do you have any others? Sorry, I interrupted.
That's all right for now. I've got those two.
Neo-Nazi. Today people who espouse Nazi ideology, it's not exactly like the Nazi ideology of the 1930s and 40s. So rather than just refer to it as Nazism or to refer to someone who is like that as a Nazi, it's now neo-Nazis. And that's quite possibly where you might have heard the neo term most frequently used. It's the same fascist ideology, but it's kind of a new manifestation of it.
Good word.
So I just wanted us to see, we've heard this quite a lot, and we might have heard it subconsciously or not picked up on it, the new connotations. I think there's others as well, but neo-Nazi is the one that comes to mind. Thank you, Josephine. Sharon?
I was just going to say neonatal is the word we often use to refer to newborn babies or even babies that are born like prematurely.
You know, I heard Josephine say neonatal and I couldn't remember what it meant, so I just concentrated on neo-Nazi. So thank you, someone that knows what they're talking about to educate us. So it's a new baby. Is that too simple? It's that new concept of new?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, thank you. Molly?
I thought that the paleo is sort of talking about conservative ideology, and neo is sort of a change. There's especially with the cultural.
Sorry, I missed a word in there. You said paleo is conservative. What did you say neo was?
Neo is a required change.
So that there's changed.
Yeah, especially
change.
when we shift our ideology from right to left.
These are both conservative in the context we're discussing them. So it's still right wing, but they're different variations of right wing conservatism. I still think that your point is valid. I've not necessarily proven it yet, I suppose, if some people are questioning it. But I would say paleo is much further right wing. So neo is less far right. Paleo is what developed into the alt-right. Is that okay, Molly?
Yeah.
Are we disagreeing, or I think I'm understanding you correctly?
No, I agree with that one. Yeah.
Thank you. Catherine?
It's a bit of a question. Would it be accurate to describe one of them as wanting to spread their culture everywhere around the globe, and the other one is wanting to preserve their culture by building a bubble around it or a wall around it?
I'm not sure about the spreading culture so much, because I think that there's a certain amount that should be spread. I suppose my hesitancy with the spreading culture part is, are universal human rights cultural? And if they're attempting to spread universal human rights, they're not attempting to spread Western culture, because universal human rights are not Western culture, which I know that you and I agree on, so I don't think we're disagreeing there, just on the wording of spreading.
So them being conservatives, are you saying that they were concerned with the human rights of other countries and not just their own, spreading their own culture? Like, one sounds good and one sounds bad, but do you think that someone like George Bush was, what his motivation was more to do with the human rights than sort of Americanizing the world, the other countries, or dominate? I guess I had this picture of them just sort of wanting to dominate or something. I don't know.
If that's how you meant it, then I agree.
Okay.
But I think I would agree with both.
Okay.
I think that George Bush was motivated by suppressing a country that he saw as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of need to dominate and have this invincible army and be the unilateral most powerful country on earth was a motivating factor. I also believe that with a degree of arrogance and a degree of naivety, they genuinely believed that just by toppling a government, they could bring equality, human rights, freedom, and a democratic government to Afghanistan. I think that was incredibly naive and arrogant, but not necessarily a wrong motivation.
Okay, thank you.
But so I think I would agree with both points there. The problem is that if we look at Afghanistan as radical feminists, the misogyny in society in Afghanistan is easily seen through the Taliban, but it's actually cultural. I shared an article to prove that point. Again, I've been trying to nail culture and the universality of misogyny in culture for a long time. I shared an article on the media broadcast around August last year of a woman who had worked for years in Afghanistan to fight for the rights, in basic rights of women. And her point was the Taliban is terrible, but life without the Taliban was terrible too, because the misogyny is cultural. And the United States could not just go in and overthrow the Taliban because what they're fighting would be fighting in the United States, in Afghanistan, is culture. But they're not, I don't think that's imposing Western culture on Afghanistan. What it should be about, if their motivations were pure, and I'm sure they weren't, would be about universal human rights. What do you do when you have a country that is committing horrific human rights violations? So I'm sorry, I think, Catherine, we agree, but I got off on a tangent. My brain went off. I can't remember. Can you repeat yourself, Catherine?
Okay, I said, the way I said it was, could we frame it as one of them is one of those groups, so paleo, they're wanting to put a bubble around their culture, protect their culture, put a wall around, and they're kind of trying to preserve their own culture and don't, let the rest of the world, we don't care. And the neo one would have, I said, could we say that they wanted to, their culture was still top to them, but they wanted to spread it around the world? Was it, could we phrase it like that?
I think you've pinpointed paleo quite well. It's that bubble around culture. It's the preservation of it. So yes, I think so. Brendan?
I hope I can explain this question well enough. Just in what you're talking with Catherine there, you've got so the group that brings in the Sunday law is the paleo, or the old, or the isolationists. And when we go back to prophecy leads us, we would think, well, on the board, you would write up on the board and say, oh, what am I- so the America would be the ruler of the 10 kings, as an example, and so they would be they would dominate the 10 kings. But when I look at, how does that work when I look at the paleo isolationists? Because now the neo or the interventionists are dead, and how does America now dominate the 10 kings when they're isolationists and now they're not interventionists? How do we see that now? Because are they now leading by a looking inward nationalism that then that spreads globally? Am I asking the question okay?
You are.
Because now we're looking at something different now, because originally my original brain would have thought, well, if America's the boss of the 10 kings, that would make me automatically go, well, isn't that the neo? They're the interventionists, they're forcing the 10 kings. But now I've got the Sunday law is being driven by isolationists. So they're inward looking, they're not really caring what's happening to the 10 kings. Am I saying that correctly?
You are. I think that I'd like to give a bit of a history of paleoconservatism and discuss it a little bit more before answering, though. Because part of the reason we're doing that is to assess the left wing, and the parts of the left wing that I have the most problems with, where the problems are most explicit, are very much, it's not the isolationists of the paleoconservative, but it's the hatred and the fear of colonialism that makes them also quite isolationist. And that was not Hillary Clinton. And Hillary Clinton was, if not the entirety of the solution, she was to a large extent the start of it. And she's the Clinton of Benghazi. She's not isolationist. So I think the discussion of isolationism and the motivations behind the different groups would probably need discussing before answering that question. I don't think all intervention is about domination in that way. Motivations have become important. So if you don't mind, we'll come back to that, but I'll give a bit of history first. Josephine, sure. Thank you.
I've got a few words floating in my head. I just wondered if they fit into the discussion at the moment, like a new manifestation, same entity, only worse. How does that have any connection at all with what we're talking about right now? And I'm thinking prophecy, going back to Revelation, Daniel, sixth head, seventh. Maybe I'm digging around the wrong place.
I'm not sure how to answer that right now. I can say it's a new manifestation of conservatism, but it's always been there. And I think, but sometimes it's just what was there before bubbling up again. Isn't that kind of the point? It has a deadly wound and death and it comes back. I think that's worth considering when we look back at Millerite history, and if this is the world today, and we believe that it's the Sunday law test is, if we believe that the Sunday law test is global, then all of these become little countries. And you have Ukraine. I won't make it the biggest one. Let's say you have China and you have Russia And you have Uganda. And you have France. And you have the USA. If you were to take that, which is today, if you were to take that back and make that a terrible circle, USA, Millerite history, then you have all of these states. And you would have Texas and Mississippi, and you would have New York, and I don't think Washington gets state status, but you would have the seat of government. The wrong side of the debate in Millerite history, what was their excuse to attack the government, to secede from the Union? How did they see the government versus their freedoms? Brandon.
Well, it was states' rights, but it was the government intervening and interfering with their freedoms to do what they want to do in their own states.
And what do you call that? When faraway government decides to intervene in your territory?
I guess that would be imperialism.
It's imperialism. Colonialism, imperialism. And I get that there's a difference because it's one country, but it's similar. You can contrast it. There's a difference. They are under Washington to an extent that Uganda is not under the United States, but it's the same issue. It's the same. There's also that comparison where what Texas is arguing is it is imperialistic for the government of, that's really the government, and they would argue it's like the government of the North. It's the northern states. It's not even their government. It's what the northern states have chosen to come over to our territory, and don't tell us Texans that racial rights are universal human rights. That is cultural imperialism. It's a similar argument to what has been discussed in the first article I shared by the UN Human Rights Commissioner. What are some countries arguing? They're not saying, it's okay, France, be Islamophobic, France, because we know that racial rights are culturally interpreted. That's not an argument being made today. The argument being made today is that gender rights, rights for women and rights for LGBT people are not universal, but must be defined by cultures, internal cultures. And they will say the West, because it usually works out this way, for the West to come into our culture and speak about, promote, try to force through universal human rights for women is neo or new colonialism, neo or new imperialism. That's the fight that the first article was discussing. That's why it was given the title, very deliberately given the title, because they know what the core issue was that he was fighting. Do not dare to tell me women's rights are not universal. Do not dare to tell me that LGBT rights are not universal. Hillary Clinton's speech, what was the speech she was famous for? Don't remember it exactly, but women's rights are human rights. Human rights are women's rights. They are universal. That's what she was fighting for. And by the time you get to 2016, that is what she's angry about. It's part of the reason she was the solution to the problem. Not many people, not many women, Ilhan Omar even, AOC, they are not thinking that way. They are not fighting for that. Therefore, they are part of the problem and not the solution. So when we talk about intervention, and isolationist versus interventionalist. This is why I'm being careful, because there is a genuine danger of imperialism and colonialism, an extensive history of that. But when you have human rights violations, can the United States, like Germany did, say, well, we have done some terrible things and we have made mistakes in the past, therefore we should sit back and not be hypocritical and condemn another country for theirs? I want us to see that in the context of Millerite history. Does that make sense, Brendan? There's contrasts, but there's comparisons.
Yes, thank you.
I really encourage us to reread that first and the second article, especially the first. Ray.
I was just gonna say basically the same thing that Brendan did.
Your hand went up at the same time, so I wondered. Is there anything you want to add on to that?
The thing I was going to say was they would have compared the government to the King of England, that sort of.
Yes.
Yeah.
I want to suggest that paleoconservatism is old conservatism because it was so much in existence back here. It was very much the government of the South. The government of Lincoln frightened the South so much because it was a change from what they had had before. Old conservatism is isolationism and states' rights, which is just an internal pocket of isolationism. What did the United States do the minute their revolution ended and all of a sudden France needed help? What was their position? Sorry, we're isolationist. Deal with it yourself, France. That is, while there was differences of opinions, the majority of that early history of the United States was more isolationist than what you find in a neoconservative today, I would suggest. Therefore, I think that when they call themselves paleo, because that's something they call themselves, not that was given to them, they have a point. I think that they have a point, that they are the older and more original form of conservatism. In opposition to Lincoln, as flawed as he was. Graham.
My question goes back to a little bit to 15 minutes ago. Does the intervention by God and Jesus in heaven of the revolt of Lucifer, and also then coming down to earth and intervening there and changing the culture of that place, become a prophetic model for us?
I think that question is a very deep one. It depends, I think, if we see it as a separate country in a way, but I certainly don't think that God has been anything approaching isolationist or anything approaching libertarian. I don't fully understand how the great controversy works. I think that we are, piece by piece, seeing behind the curtain and unpacking it. I don't quite get all the rules of warfare. I see that this country, this earth as a whole, voted for one government, for a freedom over equality model that Adam and Eve voted for. Therefore, Lucifer became king of this earth. It was his governmental model that was going to rule. And then I've kind of viewed it as the Godhead really kind of as a shadow government, as an opposition government. And sometimes the opposition government can publicly fight, but they don't have that much power. So people ask, if God is real, why do such terrible things happen? It's because he's the opposition government. You don't vote Republican, then not be able to afford medical bills and say, why haven't you sorted out the healthcare system in the United States? They can't do very much. So I don't understand all of how the Great Controversy works. But as we get deeper into some of these subjects, a lot makes more sense. I think I've predominantly viewed it as it really, rather than God being of a separate government, the Godhead having or of a separate country, that they are part of this country, but the opposition government. Perhaps there's another way, another parable to look at it, though, that would go into this. I think it's too deep a question for me to want to comment without thinking of it more, though. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you.
I do think that we can understand, even just in understanding World War I and World War II as the moves of the current government in office, why horrific things have happened, and under whose leadership those horrific things have taken place, and questioned that under a government where God does believe in freedom, equality over freedom, but still believes in freedom, that when Adam and Eve and the majority of this planet vote for that type of government, when and how can God intervene, and when and how can he not? So I'll just give a couple of, I think a couple of points, and then we will close for time. I just wanted to give a little bit of history of paleo versus neoconservatism. And as we've done, coming back to this model, it's old. It's not a new concept, but it has become much clearer that there are these two sides, and it's not all neat. Some people straddle both. Some people are 75% paleo, 25% neo. It's always been that way. But if we were to do just a little bit more of a recent history, going right back to the 1920s, leading up to and then into the 1920s, you had these two sides versus expansion, progressivism, and a more isolationist, anti-immigration approach. From what I have read, and I'm just going to scan through a few different sources that I've read, the paleoconservatism was powerful in the 20s and 30s, but the problem was everything else, less extreme conservatism, kept being so successful. Other models kept being so successful. The New Deal was quite successful. Then you come to the 1940s and you have World War II. And as you would expect, conservatives were split over World War II, whether to get involved, neoconservative, or to be isolationist and yet let Europe fight it out themselves, paleoconservative. The problem for the paleoconservatives is that the United States did get involved, and World War II was won by the Allied forces, and that made neoconservatism or interventionism in general look really good. It made it attractive to people. So because intervention and the New Deal and these different forces of interventionism and progressivism was successful, paleoconservatism, isolationism, that more extreme right-wing ideology never really gained enough traction to make a major impact. Then you come to the civil rights movement, and conservatives began to reject explicit racism. It became less popular to be explicitly racist. And paleoconservatism kind of slunk even more into the background. Then when you come to the 1980s and 1990s, their voices, paleoconservatism, that old school isolationist, anti-immigration, kind of xenophobic, far-right ideology didn't have a major voice, but it had some, especially under Pat Buchanan. He's the most prominent apostle of the old right of paleoconservatism, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, and he did hold Pat Buchanan positions of influence under the Nixon and Reagan administrations. He ran for president in 1992 on an America First slogan that they say echoed the 1940s isolationists, those who wanted to stay out of World War II, and previewed Trump. So paleoconservatism under Pat Buchanan in 1992, America First. They talk about Phyllis Schlafly. She's best known for defeating the Women's Equal Rights Amendment. She opposed the Vietnam War, isolationist, paleoconservative. Opposed Bill Clinton's humanitarian intervention in Bosnia and most international agreements since, paleoconservative, isolationist. They list some other paleoconservative writers, Joseph Sobran, who's a Holocaust denier, Taki Theodorakopoulos, anti-Semitic and racist. But also, by the time you get into the 1990s, paleoconservatism, even though it's quiet, it's started to become a little bit more popular. So if we were to trace the 1940s, Neo really has a lot of influence here because World War II, and it made intervention look good. It took down Hitler. Then you come to, I'll skip a lot of history, but you come to 1989. And between World War II and 1989, you have the Cold War. And neoconservatism, interventionalism is quite popular through that history. Even paleoconservatives and even libertarians kind of took the position, okay, isolationist except for against the Soviet Union because they're just so dangerous and they're so bad, we need to fight them. So it was, even paleoconservatism here was particularly kind of limited. But 1989, the Soviet Union falls. And what is left really to intervene in now? What great big threat do neoconservatives have that they have as a type of excuse to intervene in the world? And they say that around here, you can kind of see, you can see the foreshadowing of the rise of paleoconservatism. But what really took it down was you had 9/11, and then you had 2003, and you had the Iraq War. 2003, and of course in that history, the Afghanistan War. 2008, you have the election of Barack Obama. 2009, he takes office. Just when the old right seemed on the verge of extinction, the world changed. First, George Bush's disastrous invasion of Iraq undermined conservative support for the hawkish foreign policy that had been Republican orthodoxy since Reagan. Second, the 2008 financial crash and the sluggish recovery that followed undercut the enthusiasm among voters, if not elected officials, for the free trade pacts that market conservatives promoted. So trade's also involved in this isolationist argument. The refusal of the increasingly paleocon House Republican caucus to pass Bush's troubled asset relief program in late 2008 was in retrospect a harbinger of the fissures that erupted in 2016. Third, the prospect that whites would soon constitute a minority in an increasingly multiracial, polyglot society inspired a resurgent rise in this fear of replacement. So 2008, but really 2009, there's a switch, and we'll stop here for time. But this is where you find a switch between neo to paleo. And much of what we've discussed in the past, talking about the Monroe Doctrine, we're going to start here next week, and I'll add to that. But much of what we've spoken about really fits into this history, 1989 to 2009. That's when it was under neoconservatism. George Bush and his war hawks, that entire system of type of Republican government really died a death in 2009, and that is a prophetic marker. It's the increase of knowledge before the Sunday Law for a reason, an increase of knowledge before 2014. It is for the line of the priests, 2019, what 2019 is for the line of the 144,000. It's a significant marker. And what you're seeing is a change in the conservative movement between neocon and paleocon. And paleocon is where the deepest, darkest threat lies. It's paleoconservatism that gave birth in 2009 to the alt-right. The alt-right came directly out of paleoconservatism, and they pin its beginning to 2009. We'll stop here for time, but we'll start there again next week and talk about its rise. Talk about 2009 and the rise of paleoconservatism and some more implications of that. Again, the whole point of this is so that we can go into the left wing and analyse their mistakes. But if you have questions or thoughts, please try to remember them for next week. If I kneel, Josephine, would you mind closing in prayer for us?
I don't mind.
Thank you.
I can do that. Gracious Lord, we thank you so much for the Sabbath day. We thank you that we can gather together as a group to study your word, to expand our minds, to search our hearts, to listen to the message you have given to your servant, and to embrace it. Thank you, Lord, for these exercises. It has taught us so much. We should count ourselves as very blessed to have instructions from above to help us to direct our footsteps, help us to navigate through complicated history, complicated times in which we are walking through. We look forward always to Vespers, because we know that our minds are going to be challenged, and we bless you and thank you and give you all the glory. Bless everyone that's present here tonight, and bless your people all over the world that would be listening to the videos. Bless our leaders, Lord, and thank you for being with us and walking together with us through history and through these times. In Jesus' wonderful name, we praise you. Amen.
Amen. Just one thought before we close, I guess a question to think of during the week. Trump's election helped promote, facilitate the rise of authoritarianism worldwide. It wasn't the cause of it or the sole cause of it. Countries carry their own guilt, but it played a part in it. So if Trump is predominantly paleoconservative, which he is, how come his election had that kind of international response? Keeping in mind that when we say authoritarianism, as a recent article made the point, is inextricably linked to abusive patriarchal culture. Just something to think about, to consider the 2016 through to 2022 impact of Trump's election internationally. That's all. I hope you have a happy Sabbath, and thank you everyone for participating so much. It's nice.